Welcome to the AIB webinars. International business scholars are continuously engaging in studying the multinational enterprise and analyzing critical issues of relevance to both practice and scholarship. We've been running this webinar series for 3 years now, and we have by now quite a collection that you can reach on YouTube. Our idea is to talk about research that has been published in our journals, Journal of International Business Studies, Journal of International Business Policy, and pick 3 papers that speak to a common theme, and then expand on that, on the bigger questions of the implications of this research, both for practice, but also for, where are the gaps in research that we should be addressing. And we try to bring different perspectives, which is one of the nice things about the IB community. We have scholars with different disciplinary background, so we bring different perspectives on a common theme. You are able to actively participate in this webinar. We have the Q&A function in Zoom. Please use the Q&A function to post your questions. My co-host, Stephanie Wang, will be moderating the conversation. She will be looking at the Q&A function and pick questions from there to pose to the presenters. Today's topic is how can multinational enterprises navigate rising nationalism and political tensions around the world, which is really a hot topic, not just among scholars, but really also in corporate boardrooms. With that, let me hand over to Stephanie, who is an associate professor at Kelley School in Indiana University. Many of you will be familiar with Stephanie's work in the field of international business, especially at the interface between business, government, and also social responsibility. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Klaus. Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am absolutely delighted to welcome all of you to today's webinar on how can multinational firms navigate rising nationalism and political tension. Whether you are joining us from the comfort of your homes, offices, from various corners of the world, we are really thrilled to have you here with us. As Klaus mentioned, today's webinar really focuses on arguably one of the most complex and pressing IB topic in recent years, rising nationalism and political tensions. So therefore, we gathered a panel of distinguished speakers and experts, 3 of them. So they will share their knowledge and expertise based on their recent publications in JIPS or JIP. And also, as Klaus talked about, it's not just about speakers, it's also about you, the audience. So we value your participation and engagement. So throughout the webinars, we encourage you to ask questions, share your thoughts in the chat. Your insights and questions are really an essential part of making this webinar a truly enriching experience. And we are also excited to announce that for the first time, we will also be launching a podcast series with the audio part of our webinar. So we hope to provide an additional platform to inspire and engage the IB community for interesting topics like today. So without further ado, let's dive into today's really exciting program. So the 3 papers that will be presented today, I trust you all read those. Myself find those really interesting and really inspiring. So the 3 papers are really complementary in their approaches of studying nationalism and political tension, and also their impacts and implications for the IB research. So they provide different angles and perspectives in terms of this conceptualization, theorization, operationalization, right? How do we operationalize nationalism? A really, sometimes really difficult task, and also managerial and political implication. So our very first paper, titled The Rising of Techno Geopolitical Uncertainty, Implications of the United Chips and Science Act, will be presented by Ari Van Assche. So Ari, I'm sure people in this virtual room know Ari's work a lot. So there are a lot of great things about Ari, so I'm just going to quickly highlight a few. So Ari is a full professor in international business and director of International Institute of Economic Diplomacy at HEC Montreal. He is the incoming editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Business Policy and also a fellow of AIB. He specializes in studying global value chain and their implications for public policy. He has been published widely in a lot of journals, and also I think one of the distinctiveness of Ari is he's also been serving by consulting for various Canadian and international governmental organizations, including the Global Affairs Canada, Transport Canada, and Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. Ari, thank you so much for joining us, and the virtual floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Stephanie and Klaus, for this great introduction. Let me just quickly share my screen. Let me know if you cannot see it well. Okay, perfect. So thank you very much. So this is a point article that I've co-written with Yatong Luo from the University of Miami, where we argue that the recent U.S. Chips and Science Act, which was put into place last summer, is part of a larger portfolio of techno-nationalist policies that the United States, but also other countries like China and a little bit the European Union have been putting into place, which is something that international business scholars should be paying significant attention to. So what we do in the paper is we try to provide a logic why these new types of policies have come up. And we talk about some of the pitfalls that are related to this type of policies. And then we go into explaining what the implications are for multinational strategy, but also for international business scholarship in general. So just to provide a flavor of what exactly techno-nationalism is, I'm not going to provide a definition, but I'm going to give a quote by the US Biden administration's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan. So what he quite recently indicated is that we have to revisit the long-standing premise of maintaining relative advantages over competitors in certain key technologies. We previously maintained a sliding scale approach that said we need to stay only a couple of generations ahead. That is not the strategic environment we are in today. Given the foundational nature of certain technologies, like advanced logic and memory chips, we must maintain as large a lead as possible. So what you see here in the statement is a number of things. First of all, you see a clear link being made between certain key technologies like semiconductors and national security. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, what is being indicated is that the policies of today, these techno-nationalist policies, should not just be giving a relative advantage, but an absolute advantage where we are strengthening, for example, the United States. But if we are weakening what is happening elsewhere, this is not a bad thing. So it's very much a realist policy, a zero-sum type of policy. Now, the moment that we start thinking about this from the perspective of the semiconductor industry, what we point out in the article is that we need to understand how global value chains are organized and where the United States, because the U.S. Chips and Science Act is a U.S. act, where the strengths are for the United States and where the weaknesses are. And so I'm not going to go through this entire slide here, but I just want to point out that when we're looking at where the US perceives that they've been developing weaknesses, it really is in the fabrication parts of semiconductors. There, if you look at the middle of the figure, you're finding out that fabrication is highly concentrated in Asia, and especially in Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and also increasingly in China as well. And this is being considered a concern within the United States and a reason why they want to be bringing some of this fabrication back to the United States. I do want to point out, though, that this figure also demonstrates that there are a number of areas where the United States has very strong competencies. And this is really in the design parts, the intellectual property parts, and in the tooling parts. And this is really important because the U.S. Chips and Science Act and some of the other policies really are about addressing weaknesses, but also exploiting strengths, as I will be demonstrating in the next couple of minutes. So What is the U.S. Chips and Science Act? Well, first of all, it is a new type of industrial policy. It's a part of a new wave of industrial policy that we are seeing all around the globe. So what this act does is pour $52 billion into trying to strengthen U.S. Semiconductor manufacturing, but also R&D and workforce development. And they're doing this through subsidies, but also through tax credits as well. So it really is industrial policy to bring back production to the United States. Of course, the US does this, and what happens is that Korea reacts and says, we do the same thing. Japan reacts and says, we'll do the same thing. European Union is doing the same thing. China is doing the same thing. So one of the problems with this type of policies is it really is a kind of a beggar thy neighbor type of policy. Now, what we indicate in the paper is that in addition to being a simple industrial policy, we need to be paying attention to some of the guardrail provisions that are being provided in this act as well. So what the US indicates is, look, if a company receives funding from the US Chips and Science Act, they are prohibited for the next 10 years of engaging in any significant transaction all around the globe that might help China build strength in semiconductor manufacturing without approval from the US Department of Commerce. So what you're seeing here is a bit of a carrot and a stick going on. And this is really important because besides the US Chips and Science Act, what the US has been doing is they know that they are extremely powerful in design and in intellectual property rights. And what they've been doing is develop secondary sanctions or first direct product rule provisions where any US company or any company that is using US intellectual property for their actions in the semiconductor industry are not allowed to conduct also significant transactions that might be helping the Chinese semiconductor manufacturing industry. So what is happening is there really is this type of policies of pushing companies to choose either you're with the United States or you're against the United States, which is quite remarkable in these policies. This is all part of new policies that we argue are trying to weaponize global value chains. The US knows that they are very strong in certain choke points in the semiconductor industry, and they're trying to use that to try to direct companies outside of the United States who they are working with and trying to use that for their own geopolitical purposes. I'm just going to very quickly show a book that everybody should be reading right now. It's called Underground Empire by Henry Farrell and Abram Newman. It came out a couple of weeks ago, but it really is all about this weaponizing interdependence that I'm talking about here as well. In the article, and I'm not going to go through this entire table over here, in the article, we point out that there are a number of dangers or risks related to this type of techno-nationalist policies. I'm very quickly going to mention three. One is, of course, that it is going to lead to more geopolitical conflict. If you're looking in the media, how China has been reacting to the US Chips and Science Act, they're not taking very well, and they are somewhat retaliating versus certain companies. And so this is something that is important. The other thing that we have to be very careful about is that this might well, from a US perspective, create some kind of a Sputnik moment in China as well, where China now is even more convinced than they were before that if they want to remain competitive in certain strategic industries, that they need to be putting lots and lots more money and efforts into it. And so this idea that right now, by putting these restrictions onto the Chinese industry, that this in the long term will be beneficial is not very clear. And then the third point, which we spend a lot of time into in the article, is that we need to be very careful that as we're trying to build up the semiconductor industry of the United States, that we're not throwing out the rules-based international order with the World Trade Organization, et cetera, out with the bathwater in the process. All these techno-nationalist policies go against the traditional view of leveling the playing field, ensuring competitive neutrality, and so we need to make sure that we're not creating very important unintended consequences in the process. The final thing that I want to point out, and we can talk much more about this in the question and answer, is we do spend quite a bit of time thinking about the implications for multinational firms. And here, so we point to 4 different strategic implications. I want to focus on 2 here. The first is that geopolitical risks are very different from political risks, how it is being discussed in the field of international business. What this means is that companies, as they're trying to deal with geopolitical risk, need to be developing new capabilities that we've not been discussing very much in the past. They need to be knowing much more what is going on in the world. We know that all this is very complicated, as we saw recently with the Middle East, as we've been seeing with Russia and the Ukraine as well. So this is really an area where much more research is necessary. The second and related point is that this idea that multinational firms simply can create 2 different supply chains for 2 different regions in the world, one for the United States, one for China, and maybe one for another region. This just doesn't work in this type of environment. The cartoon that you can see here, but people on the podcast cannot see, indicates that Biden is indicating that this town ain't big enough for both of us. Well, ultimately, companies in certain key strategic industries will have to be making a choice. Do they want to operate in a US-related environment, or do they want to operate in a China-related environment? But you cannot play both cards as easily as we might be thinking right now anymore. So these are some of the issues that we've been discussing. I can give many more examples later on, but because of time, I do want to stop here.
Thank you so much, Ari. So yeah, Ari's paper is basically focused on one aspect of nationalism, which is techno-nationalism. And I like how they started with talking about the origin of this political tension, really giving us a lot of great inspiration in terms of policies. I also like how they really land on implications for multinationals, which is a focus of our today's webinar. How can multinational firms do and therefore act, right? All right, so let's move to our second paper titled The Influence of Societal Nationalist Sentiment on Trade Floors, which will be presented by Ilya Cuypers. So Ilya is currently associate professor at Li Hong Chen School of Business at Singapore Management University. Ilya received his PhD from Tilburg University, Netherlands. His work falls into the area of IB and strategic management. He's currently serving as a senior editor of Journal of Work Business. He's a formal associate editor of AMJ, Academy of Management Journal, and a guest editor of JIBS, Journal of International Business Studies. His current research focuses on governance, dynamics, and performance implications of cross-border external corporate development activities, investment decisions under uncertainty, and geopolitical issues, such as nationalism. Today, we are going to talk about. All right, Ilya, the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. And thank you to the AIB for organizing and inviting me. Thank you to Klaus as well. And thank you to everybody for joining. So I'm normally a strategy scholar. With this paper, which is joint work with Douglas Dow, I'm trying to do something a little bit more aggregate. We're looking at trade flows, but we're looking at the influence of societal nationalist sentiments on these trade flows. Okay, so let me kind of first lay out the focus of our work a little bit. Okay, there's a fair bit of work that has looked at nationalism IB that typically conceptualizes nationalism as a matter of policy. I think Ari's paper kind of falls in this stream as well, and often this is referred to as economic nationalism, maybe techno-nationalism, and so onwards. In this particular piece, we shift our attention to another type of nationalism, which we also think is important. And it's conceptually distinct, less studied, and we refer to this as nationalist sentiments. Okay? To clarify a little bit more what we mean by nationalist sentiments, we cannot draw from the political science and social psychology literature. There has been a fair bit of attention on the impact of nationalist sentiments, and a lot of work looks at nationalist sentiments there as an individual attitude that's often manifested in everyday beliefs, assumptions, and behaviors of individuals. So if it affects individuals, arguably, it would also affect managers in their choices and behavior, consumers, and so onwards, actors which are more close to what we typically do in IB research. Okay. Then these beliefs and assumptions and behaviors are typically shared among the population of a country. And this turns this into a societal level phenomenon, similar to individuals having certain cultural values, and then that aggregates into a national culture. So what we refer to as these kind of aggregated beliefs, assumptions, and behavior related to nationalism, we refer to this as nationalist sentiments. Okay. If I'm a little bit more specific or more detailed, we conceptualize nationalism or nationalist sentiments in the following way. We use a broadly embraced definition of nationalist sentiments by Kosterman and Fishbach, and we see nationalist sentiments as a perception of national superiority and an orientation towards national dominance, and it consistently implies a downward comparison of other nations. So what's kind of important to emphasize in this conceptualization, first of all, there's a clear distinction between the in-group and the out-group. The in-group could be people, products, or firms from your own country, and they're considered to be different than the out-group, people, products, firms from foreign countries. And this definition also stresses that the in-group is perceived to be qualitatively different from the out-group. The in-group is typically viewed more favorably than the out-group. Okay? Based on this kind of conceptualization, there's a substantial body of work in social psychology, political science that has attributed a number of behaviors and attitudes that then are commonly associated with stronger nationalist sentiments. Okay, let me kind of summarize 4 of them very quickly, because that's kind of the foundation of some of our predictions. First of all, in countries where there's stronger nationalist sentiment, there's typically a stronger superiority bias. So the in-group is typically seen as more superior than the out-group. The second behavioral attitude is that there's also a tendency to exhibit favoritism towards the in-group. So again, at the expense of the out-group. And the third observation that we see in the literature is that stronger nationalist sentiments are typically also associated with lower trust in the out-group. Okay, so out-group members, products, people typically are trusted less in countries with stronger nationalist sentiments. And then finally, what we see is that nationalist sentiments, or what the research has shown, is that nationalist sentiments generally lead to a greater reluctance to interact with the out-group. Okay, so people prefer less interactions with people that are foreign and so on. Okay, so just to kind of highlight, we kind of built on some of these behaviors and attitudes that have been established before into our arguments. Before I go to our predictions, I would like to talk a little bit about the research design. Again, not in detail, but just to give you the right elements, I think, that are needed to make sense of our prediction. Okay, so we're studying the impact of nationalist sentiments on international trade flows using a standard gravity model setup. So you'll probably find all the control variables you typically find in the gravity model in our regression models. Okay, 2 dependent variables. One dependent variable is we look at imports, and the second one is exports. Okay, I think that's not atypical either. Then that's maybe worth to emphasize a little bit more. We use a key explanatory measure of nationalist sentiments, which is based on the national identity module of the ISSP survey. Also use that in some other recent work with Gökhan Ertuğ, Douglas Dow again, and Jesper Edman. So I think well-established measure outside management and IB research, but we're trying to bring that measure into our field as well. Okay. What might be a little bit different from the typical gravity model is that we have a mediation model approach. Okay, so we're going to argue for a direct path between nationalist sentiment and exports and imports, but also an indirect path where nationalist sentiments is going to impact exports and imports through trade policy, or if you like, economic nationalism. Okay, so for both imports and exports, we'll have a prediction that goes through that direct path and that goes through that indirect part. Okay. Let me now start with our 2 predictions, or our 3 predictions related to imports. First of all, with the indirect part, we start from the premises that nationalist sentiments put pressures on policymakers to express favoritism and act in the national interest. So national sentiment among the population is going to push for discrimination in favor of one's own nation, companies, products, and that might translate in policymakers carrying this through as a matter of policy. Okay. We specifically argue that nationalist sentiments will reduce the likelihood of free trade agreements and will increase the likelihood or the extent of tariffs. Okay, so that's the first part of the indirect relationship. And then we build on existing work that argues that tariffs reduce imports, that free trade agreements positively affect imports. So to this, we basically argue nationalist sentiment reduces free trade agreements, increases tariffs, and as a result, it's going to have an impact on imports. Okay. Then secondly, we argue for a direct path. Okay. Customers, managers also make decisions based on the national sentiment that might more directly impact imports. Okay. Going back to some of these attitudes and behavior, we argue that the superiority bias leads to a stronger preference for local firms, local products, which are considered superior over foreign products, foreign firms. Okay. Second layer of the argument, we might also see customers express favoritism towards and biased choices toward local products and firms. And then finally, related to the trust kind of behavior or attitude I outlined earlier, people might also have lower trust in more nationalist societies, in foreign firms and products. So based on this, we argue that nationalist sentiments would have a direct negative impact on imports. Okay, so if we look at the results, they were somewhat surprising, at least in our kind of against our intuition. Okay, so first of all, H1 is not supported. Okay, so we don't find an effect to tariffs, but we do find an effect to free trade agreements. Okay. Then secondly, we don't find a direct effect of nationalist sentiments on imports. Okay. In the paper, we play around with contingencies, we look at distance between countries, we look at being part of a trade bloc. I think that adds a lot of nuance here, which might give a little bit more perspective why we don't find these results. But I'll hold off on that. If you're interested, please read the paper. Okay. Then we look at exports, and I think there things get a little bit more interesting. Okay. So first of all, we again argue for an indirect path, which is quite similar. The only difference is that we only focus on free trade agreements because typically you don't impose tariffs yourself on your export. So basically tariffs are not relevant here. So we replicate the same argument. Nationalist sentiment put pressures on policymakers, less likely to enter in free trade agreements, less favorable conditions to export, so a reduction of exports. So that's very much paralleling H1B in the hypothesis for imports. Then when it comes to the direct effects, we argue that nationalist sentiments might also impact exports. Okay? Again, favoritism might lead managers to favor local customers, to look for local opportunities at the expense of foreign ones. Okay? Then that would mean local opportunities are prioritized. That might mean less exports. Managers might have less trust in foreign opportunities and distributors if they come from a country with stronger nationalist sentiments. Again, less trust in foreign opportunities and distributors would reduce the level of exports. And then finally, if managers are less willing to interact with foreign customers because of their nationalist sentiments and foreign distributors, we also would see a decline in exports. Okay, and here we actually find support for both predictions. Okay, so here the results are less unambiguous, less nuanced. I think it's kind of straightforward, in line with our predictions. Okay, let me now kind of talk a little bit about future research. So I think what's interesting in this paper, in addition to all the interesting work on the economic policy, we find that nationalist sentiments also matter for aggregate outcomes such as trade and policy. Okay. Then I just want to kind of jump to some of my other work. In related work, the paper I just mentioned before, the Journal of Management paper, we find that nationalist sentiment also matter for very specific firm-level strategic choices. There we're looking at how nationalist sentiment affects alliance governance. So if you kind of tie these both kind of papers or these both kind of results together, I think it highlights a lot of potential for IB scholars, both for JIBP and JIBs. So let me highlight a few examples. So first of all, if it matters for aggregate outcomes such as trade and alliance government, it's not unlikely that nationalist sentiment might be relevant for other country-level factors or outcomes, multinational level ones, subsidiary level ones, and even individual ones. Okay, let me highlight a little bit further. Maybe more in the scope of JIBP, maybe it's interesting to explore further and deeper how nationalist sentiments affect specific or other policies that might affect multinationals. Okay? Maybe more for a JIBs audience. It would be interesting, for instance, to explore how nationalist sentiments, either in headquarters or subsidiaries or both, affect the relationship headquarters might have with subsidiaries. Okay? And then even going much more micro, and again, that would be in the domain of JIBs, it would be interesting to see how nationalist sentiments affect managers and employees' choices and perception. And I think, again, there's enough work in social psychology to build on to make a good argument for that. So in general, in this work and my related work, we see substantial potential in taking a more sociological and cognitive approach towards nationalism in IB. Okay. So thank you very much again for inviting me, joining. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is ilya.cuypers@smu.edu.sg. And again, if you're interested in the topic, please have a look at our Journal of Management paper, which is forthcoming as well, where we look at a very different outcome, but where we also take that kind of nationalism as a societal kind of phenomenon kind of approach. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ilya. So Ilya's paper really provided us another perspective of nationalism, which is sociological, right, and cognitive perspective, and also kind of like related to Ari's presentation, although the policies in Ari's presentation is now more like mechanism, the mediator. So, and also, please continue to put on your question in the chat. So we will save the Q&A toward the end after our third presentation. All right, so a third paper titled U.S. National Security and Deglobalization. So this is more a general looking at the political tension by focusing on the overall deglobalization. So this paper will be presented by Darius Miller. Darius is a course chair in finance at Southern Methodist University, SMU, Cox School of Business, where he conducts research in finance market regulation, corporate governance, and financial disclosure. Darius' research has received numerous awards and recognition, such as the Journal of Financial Economics All-Star Paper Awards for Research Impact, and the SMU President's Associate Outstanding Faculty Award, and SMU's Academy of Distinguished Teacher. The list goes on and on. But today, again, Darius is just going to focus on this particular paper and give us some insights from a finance perspective. All right, Darius, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So it's my great pleasure to be here. This is co-authored work with David Gottsell at the University of Illinois and Ura Lel at the University of Georgia. And as mentioned, this is a paper about U.S. national security and deglobalization. So we all know from the literature, both in finance and management, right, that trade and FDI-related sort of interdependence across countries has a host of benefits, transmitting good managerial practices, technologies, labor skills across borders, but we've seen this associated decline of late in FDI flows. And it's prompted a lot of scholars to speculate on what actually is the cause, the nature, how big of a deal is it, right? How does deglobalization impact? We even see things in the financial markets, like the number of foreign firms even just listed on U.S. exchanges has dropped dramatically. And so what we do is we look at one specific important event, we think, and that's the passage of the 2007 Foreign Investment and National Security Act in the United States. And we examine specifically whether this law contributes to deglobalization trends. So if we think back, Ari was talking earlier about the periods of market integration, say in the 80s and 90s, and we had all these laws across countries that allowed foreign investors to come to different countries and invest. This is almost the exact opposite of that. How do countries operationalize a nationalist sort of agenda and impose barriers based on those nationalist agendas? Okay, and so this law really is in some ways the one that kicked off a lot of the more recent legal laws we see around the world as well. So we think it's important to study that as well. And important for in our empirical strategy, which we talk a lot in the paper, this law is only going to apply to certain covered industries that are national security concerned. And so we're going to allow for a tight identification strategy when we do our empirical analysis. So let me tell you a little bit about FINSA. So FINSA was passed in 2007, and particularly it empowered a committee in the regulator in the U.S. by the Treasury Department called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And basically that committee was created in 1975, delegated by President Ford to basically study and recommend transactions that might be detrimental to U.S. national security, so to prevent foreign takeovers of U.S. firms. And that committee had somewhat laid dormant until 2007 when FINSA was passed. So FINSA was passed as a specific remedy for the perceived inadequacy and not having power for this committee. And so this regulation dramatically increased the likelihood of an investigation under the auspices of national security of a foreign company taking over U.S. company. It increased the role of Congress and injected political uncertainty into the process. And it basically strengthened the ability of the U.S. to require all kind of national security concessions, like kicking off board members of the company in order to make sure they didn't have a conflict of interest. And it also allowed for significant penalties if the transaction wasn't in the interest of national security, all the way to completely unwinding the transaction. And so just give you a quote here, basically, this idea of the United States intelligence community believes that there may be an effort among foreign governments or companies to acquire U.S. companies involved in research, development, or production of technologies for which the United States is a leading producer. And so this law is passed in order to sort of prevent foreign companies from acquiring U.S. technologies. And so that's the study of our paper, to see whether or not these types of laws, which are proliferating now around the world, did in fact have the cooling effect or deterrent effect of multinational enterprises taking over U.S. companies. And of course, the tension we go into the paper is basically that a lot of people view globalization as irreversible. And what I'm going to show you is that a lot of these prior laws that the U.S. passed were, in fact, not very effective. So strengthening CFIUS in the 2007 FINSA law is not the first time that it occurred. There was an amendment in 1988, the Exxon-Florio Amendment. There was also the Byrd Amendment in the early 90s. And basically, in our analysis, we show that they had very little impact on the barriers that CFIUS, this committee, was putting to foreign acquisitions in the U.S. But when the 2007 FINSA was passed, we see now almost 50% of all foreign transactions, foreign companies trying to take over U.S. industries, basically were now investigated by CFIUS. And so what do we do in this paper? So in the paper, we go through great identification strategies in order to sort of tease out, did the probability of being taken over by a foreign company, a multinational, if you're in the US, did it change after the passage of this law? And basically, in our takeover models, which are well developed in the finance industry, we find, in fact, strong support for that. We find indeed that both the frequency and magnitude of takeovers by multinational companies declined after the passage of FINSA, and in particular, those ones that were for national security-related industries. And furthermore, since the concern is that high research and development companies producing these national technologies or abilities to disrupt supply chains, we can partition the sample into those above median research and development, firms that have a lot of patents and patent citation, firms that are producing a lot, so it could potentially disrupt supply chains. And we find those are the firms that are most affected by this law as well. So this deglobalization, this techno-nationalism is in fact occurring directly in these national security related firms. And it really suggests that these foreign investment screening laws, which are now proliferating all over the world, and a lot of people argue it's a direct result because of this exact law, this 2007 FINSA law, really can help explain the nature, the magnitude, and even the determinants of these recent deglobalization trends and the rise of techno-nationalism, all through these laws that are being passed. And, the conclusion is that multinationals have to navigate the political forces behind foreign investment screening laws when assessing foreign investment strategy. We saw when Broadcom trying to take over Qualcomm not too long ago, all of these, the way these foreign acquisitions of U.S. companies in these national security industries are thwarted by mostly these legal means based on these laws. And if we think about future research, we think this is a really sort of fertile area to look at all these impacts of techno-nationalism, deglobalization. there is a host of follow-on laws after the passage of FINZA that were spurred on by these big issues. There's the Foreign Investment Risk Reduction and Modernization Act of 2018, which expanded FINZA to include greenfield investments, joint ventures, and even real estate. And so we encourage researchers to leverage the cross-country heterogeneity of these foreign investment laws across the world. The OECD now reports over 33 countries worldwide have implemented these laws between 2002 and 2020. And that can really help us think about, in our paper, we really look at just the cost of these laws in terms of thwarting acquisitions of US companies, but we don't balance off, say, the national security benefits. So we think it would be very interesting to think about both the costs and benefits of these laws. And then finally, we think in this paper, we identify a rare source of exogenous variation in deglobalization, right? And it permits an opportunity to test a lot of predictions in both the finance and management literature regarding the effects of deglobalization. We know that we have all of these, not only the cross-border diffusion patterns of superior management practices, technologies, local label specializations, but even things like gender equality, sustainability, and ethics all have been sort of argued to be an impact of globalization, while our shock to deglobalization can potentially allow researchers to get an idea of these other implications of, we think, this important legal change to how global capital flows are allowed around the world with respect to nationalism. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Darius. So Darius' paper really gave us some empirical evidence about the influence of deglobalization, right? So they focus on this particular FDA screening law, the FINZA, and then looking at how that affects the frequency of firm takeovers. And the design is a classic diff in diff. So I think which is really inspiring. So now that we have completed all three papers, let's kick off our Q&A session. We have received some fantastic questions from our audience and encourage you to continue submitting your questions through the chat or Q&A features if you haven't already. Our very first question goes to Ari from Robert Gamara. I apologize if I pronounce your name incorrectly. So Ari, do you think we need to recognize that industrial policy, MNC, and the market are multifaceted and dynamic phenomena, and then we need to find out what is going on with this phenomena and then build a new understanding and conceptualization for theorizing and analysis? So I think this short question is definitely yes, but I would like to hear your insights, elaboration on how, right? And I think we will go Ari first, although the question is to Ari, but I think Ilya and Darius can chime in later because their paper is also related. So Ari.
Thanks. So Robert, this is a great question. So indeed, the answer is yes. We need to do much more research on the interaction between industrial policy, multinational firm strategy, but also the effectiveness of these policies. This is not a new topic. This is something that has been discussed for decades and decades. I think that there are some old questions that we can ask again. But at the same time, you also should be thinking about how today's industrial policies might be a bit different. So in the last presentation of Darius, he raised the excellent question of this trade-off between globalization and national security. So one thing that immediately jumps up is when we're thinking about industrial policy, what are the goals of these policies? Are these goals economic goals? There's a lot of literature on how there are market externalities that we might want to try and address with industrial policy. But then there indeed are other goals, which could be ESG goals, but then also national security goals. And depending on what the goals are, you might be looking at doing different things, and we should be thinking much more about that. One concern that I have a little bit right now with a lot of the industrial policies that are being developed is that people are making the argument that the pandemic has demonstrated resiliency concerns, which then very rapidly goes into national security issues. And then very rapidly, a solution towards resiliency is bringing things back. And I want to very quickly push back, and I can even point you to a article in JIBP in Online First by Bublu, Weigold, and Miroudon that are pointing out that it's not at all that clear that necessarily resiliency can be enhanced through reshoring or industrial policy towards reshoring. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think we need to be reflecting a bit more on is industrial policies always have the goal of changing companies' minds of how to do things. But given that right now these industrial policies are being developed in a world with global value chains, the question is a bit what exactly these industrial policies are aiming to do with respect to international business. So Darius pointed out FinCEN, where you're focusing on foreign direct investment, but indeed weaponizing global value chains is trying to get companies to change their suppliers away from certain firms that might be more interacting with your geopolitical rivals. So I think this is the second one. And then the third one, which is also a very important question that I think international business scholars should be thinking about, is how effective are these industrial policies? It is certainly interesting to see that indeed Darius's paper is finding that you have significant implications, but is it as significant as one might hope or not? And here again, I'm going to point out to a recent article in JIBP that is in Online First by Simon Everett and Niccolò Pisani that demonstrates that if you're looking at what percent of Western firms completely divested away from Russia in the first 9 months of the Ukraine war, it was somewhere between 5 and 13%. 5 and 13% is significant, but it might not be as much as people might think it should be, taking into account the sanctions that were being put into place. So thinking about the effectiveness is another area that is just really important to reflect on further in a world that has become more complicated and more integrated. So I'll leave it here.
Great, thanks, Ari. Ilya and Darius, do you want to add? Ilya, how about you go first? Yeah,
I'm fine. I think from my perspective, Ari nicely kind of highlighted it, so I don't have much to add here.
Okay. All right, let's move to the second question then. It's from Alexander Bohas. So, and also a couple of, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions from Alex, from Liu, and Tao Wu, and also maybe Soren Kama. So I think when we talk about nationalism, so naturally a lot of the comments talk about, the U.S.-Chinese tension, right? So so a lot of questions about that. For instance, Alex said, what strikes me is the place of perception of the U.S. towards China and the rapid change of perception. I think this is exactly why Ilya's paper is really coming from the sentiment perspective in terms of psychological and cognitive, in terms of, in addition to the policy, but what do people feel and perceive. Similarly, Tao talk about is the potential outcome is the techno-nationalism, the US and China decoupling in the realm of technology. This means that there could be two sets of technology standards that will be adopted by China and the US separately. So that means multinational firms who have aimed to spend between these two largest markets must adopt different standards, right? So what are the challenges and how to reshape multinationals' innovation strategy? How should we conceptualize this kind of challenge? And then, let's see, Soren also mentioned a little bit about the big elephant in the room, which although the question is kind of like specific to Ilya, but it's talking about, again, China is big, and then the sample is China, so the national sentiment instrument, maybe how can we generalize it and apply it in a different context, right? And also, can we do a dyadic, measure? This is more operational questions. Can we frame this more as dyadic? So now putting all the questions together, I think basically the fundamental question would be, given the nature of nationalism and the political tension, and then given this superpower of US and China, what are the implications for multinational firms in general? I mean, we have touched upon all three papers, but maybe I'll just push you a little bit further. So what are the one additional things you haven't talked about that you really wish to share with our audience? Maybe a good future research direction, that's something we haven't explored yet. So anything along those lines. So this time, maybe Ilya, do you want to go first?
Sorry, I was still muted. So one thing I like of what we're doing is that what we're doing is very cross-country. I think Soren has a very fair point. We don't have data for China. So we rely on a secondary database, the ISSP, but it allows us at least to study and do a cross-country study with more than 30 countries, depending on the year and so on. So I think, to me, that's important. I'm based in Singapore. We see very different kind of tendencies here. Singapore kind of exists to a large extent because of free trade. So here, policies are, and the approach towards policy is quite different than, for instance, in the US and China. And I think maybe as an outsider to this discussion, there's a lot of important discussion about China in the US and the huge economy. It's absolutely important. But I would also encourage researchers to look beyond that. Look at what is happening in other countries or other corners of the world, where the pressures might be different, where the approach to policy might be very different, where we might see different levels of nationalist sentiment in society as well. And I think one valid point that Dimitrios made in the chat as well is a lot of countries are constrained by free trade agreements or regional trade blocs. And again, that is something that differs from region to region. In our study, we play with that as a moderator, and I think that adds a lot of nuance and also explains some of the lack of findings. But again, it kind of highlights there's a lot of contextual diversity. There's a lot of different kind of ways that nationalism manifests itself that we can explore. And I think we're just started to kind of scrape the surface, and there's plenty of work to be done. Okay, I'm sure I didn't answer many of the specific questions, but I hope that kind of speaks to Stephanie's broader point here.
Perfect. Darius, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I would just say I think it's still very important to figure out the economic consequences of all this techno-nationalism, right? So, and also try to quantify the national security benefits, right? So we know sort of like if a Chinese company is not allowed to buy a wind farm right next to a US Army base, right? That potentially, has some obvious national security implications, right? But at the same time, too, when, a foreign company is not allowed to buy a US chip manufacturer and has to accept a lower bid from a US domestic company, that actually harms US shareholders. And so is that harm commensurate with the national security benefits, right? So I think we really don't have a good estimate of that as the trade-off. And I think that would inform a lot of both multinational enterprises as well as policy debates.
Perfect. Ari, do you want to add something?
So I can maybe add to the beginning of your question, which was on sentiments. When we think about techno-nationalism, we can see from all sides why you have this rise occurring. So we had a situation before where ultimately we had a push towards liberalism because we felt that trade was really good and things were going very well. The US was very much pushing for this as well, and the allies also were in line with this. Then suddenly you have China coming up, and China is doing things differently. And they're not just doing things differently, but they're actually quite successful in doing this. Are they successful because of industrial policies or state capitalism? This is a big debate. Nobody really has a clear answer to this. But then suddenly what you see in the United States is questions whether or not the fact that they have let China do what they were doing is creating a competitor that might be able to approach or even overcome the United States. And then a very natural reaction that we very often have is, well, if what we were doing doesn't work, let's try something different. And this is kind of where techno-nationalism is coming up, where you try to push for new types of policies. I think that we as scholars, on the one hand, need to be thinking a bit more carefully why these type of policies are coming up. But then again, and I will follow here Ilya and Darius, we need to be very careful in understanding whether these other types of policies are really doing what we think that they're doing. So it is great for a politician saying, hey, look, I'm doing more action to make the world a safer place, an economically better place. But that's what politicians always say. What we want to find out is whether or not there's actually data backing this up. And so as a result, I really do like the other papers in this panel that are getting to these issues.
Great. Yeah, so as we talk in the opening, right, so nationalism is a really complex concept. So we know that it is not new, right? So it has been there. So we have traditionally, economic nationalism, and then these days techno-nationalism. There are other aspects like cultural nationalism, ideology nationalism. So there are really different aspects. And then for each individual paper that we have to narrow down to a specific perspective, and then particularly if we need to optionalize it, right? So we got constraint. So speaking of that, I think there are a couple of questions coming about the political factors. So So-Young, Ivey talk about, while talking about geopolitical and political risks, the literature take a very narrow approach to clearly establish the distinction between the two. Both the risks and geopolitical and political risk, right? So both risks, they might be different, but how do we study those? Maybe what are the values, or how can we make theoretical contribution by adding value to the literature? Of course, with studying political risk, I'm sure the literature of political science will be really beneficial, right? And I think maybe adding to that, just more broadly to our panelists, are there any interplanetary approaches that you would recommend us to study this nationalism or broader political tension? And I think this is also kind of related to Mona Baha's question: what are the implications of techno-nationalism for countries such as blue economy and small nations that are highly dependent on globalization and global value chain, right? So basically, one is to study this really complex political risk. What are the approaches? What are the suggestions our panelists have, particularly maybe draw from a interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary approach? And second is really for those countries that are really highly dependent on globalization, those small economies, what are the potential interesting questions we can study? All right. Who want to go first?
I can take a stab from a finance perspective. So, in the economics and financial literature, there's a rich sort of history of examining the benefits to those particular types of companies upon liberalization, right? We know that when markets were open, they have all kind of positive capital market effects. They allow these firms to raise capital in other countries, right? And all kind of economic welfare ensues. And so I think now we're in a state where that's sort of potentially becoming unwound. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to look at what are the economic impacts of these sort of trends where we're now potentially these companies are going to be harmed by not being able to access these sort of global supply chains, transfer of technologies, right? And so I think looking at sort of the other side of the coin that we spent so much time looking at in the 80s, 90s, and aughts, right? Now it's coming full circle. I think that's a potential avenue for rich research.
If I can maybe add two things. So these are all really great questions. So the first thing I would point researchers to is, yes, in certain strategic industries, there is evidence of deglobalization going on. I think that semiconductor industry is a very clear one, but there are other ones as well. But we have to be very careful in pushing this narrative a bit too far. So there's a very nice work that was done by Stephen Altman at NYU, who has the global DHL connectedness and DHL global connectedness index. So what he finds is that there is relatively limited evidence of large-scale deglobalization, with the exception perhaps between the United States and China. So the moment you go outside of the US-China relationship, trade and investment and all these things have been continuing. Maybe if it would go deeper into certain strategic sectors, we would find it, but it's not across all the industries. Now, the point that was being made about the difference between geopolitical risk and political risk, this is actually a very interesting one. So I think the way I would look at it, both are political risks in reality, but maybe when we're thinking about geopolitical risk, we suddenly need to be thinking much more about network features. What this means is that suddenly the risk that a company is facing is not related to one country that they are in, but actually the home country where you're coming from, or the countries where you are located elsewhere, suddenly has a big impact on the risks you're facing. I might be doing certain things from a certain home country, and this influences the risk that I'm facing. I might be operating in 2 other countries, and this influences the risk I'm facing in a 3rd country. The results that I found really interesting of the study by Darius was the fact actually that the features of the company also play a role. I might be a very innovative Chinese company and I want to invest into China. And because I'm very innovative, therefore I might be, should at a certain moment the Chinese government maybe ask me as a company, as a Chinese company, to do something, it might have an influence, and this then influences the risk I'm facing in other countries. So suddenly all these aspects that we have not been reflecting on as we were working on multinational firms and political risk, home country, firm characteristics are going to play a much more important role, and we have to think about that. And then the final very quick point I want to make that Ilya already pointed out is we love looking at things from a US perspective. We love looking at things from a Chinese perspective. But if you are Singapore or you are Thailand or you're Brazil, you are looking at these issues from a very, very different perspective. You might actually not just be looking at geopolitical risks, you might be looking at geopolitical opportunities. And you might be looking at ways how to make sure that you can get competition being created between China and the United States that's going to allow you to get more opportunities for investment. So we need to be thinking about these issues as well.
Perfect. Ilya, do you have something to add?
Okay, so I think Ari's point kind of speaks to my earlier point about broadening our horizon, and also Mona's part of your question, Stephanie, where she's kind of asking about how that's going to impact these kind of open economies and things like that. And intuitively, we might think, well, it's going to lead to less trade, deglobalization, these countries are going to suffer. But I think Ari made a very good point. If you're strategic about this, you could put yourself in a kind of broker position or a neutral position, or connecting 2 polarized worlds. You could actually benefit from that as a country. But also kind of going to Darius' work, I think some of these protective measures that might prevent acquisitions, in some parts of the world, they might not be enforced equally. Okay, so let's say country X is systematically banning acquisitions from China. That might actually create opportunities for acquirers from other considered friendly countries. So if you're a UK firm, you might face less competition for the same acquisition target now in the US than you otherwise would do. Okay, so we talk a lot about the negatives of nationalism in this policy, but there's also going to be winners from these policies and maybe things we haven't naturally considered yet. And I do see a fair bit of opportunity there. And I think what Ari said, linking to Darius' research, well, there's definitely possibilities to explore these kind of opportunities as well for firms and multinationals.
Yeah, absolutely. So our audience also pointed out, for instance, Dimitri pointed out, this nationalism, it also, we can see that in EU. So it's in the rise in Italy, Poland, right? And we know that it's also in India, right? France. So there are also different sorts of nationalism and in different format, and their implications might be different. So which is perfect opportunity for IB scholar to study all those phenomena. So now let's move to maybe a final question from, we kind of like touch upon a little bit from Esmito. So we already talked about, when there is threats, the flip side is there might be opportunity. So we talk about there may be opportunity because of this geopolitical tension, because of this nationalism and techno-nationalism. So Esmito, question is, do you think it is legitimate that corporations must protect their intellectual property and national governments help do so, or everything must be put in a global basket so that the nation interests are ignored? So I think basically the question would be, let's think about innovation. So what are the broader implications on innovation and on IP in general? And then building on what we've been talking about, right? So some of the threats and maybe some of the opportunities. So any thoughts, suggestions on future research on this line? Ari, do you want to go first? Since you are the first one brought up opportunities.
Okay.
So linking to innovation, of course, is really important. If you look at all these strategic industries, whether it's pharmaceutics or biotech or semiconductors, of course, these are some of the most innovative industries. And so one thing that we've seen in the past is we love to talk about global value chains, but where production is being fragmented into different pieces. We've had the same thing in innovation going on as well. These are these global innovation chains where you start creating certain pockets of knowledge in one country and you link it with other countries as well. So I think that, again, having the opportunities and challenges being put face to face. One risk that is related to techno-nationalism and innovation is that in order to do a lot of innovation, you need to have a lot of investment. In order to have a lot of investment, you have to have a lot of return to investment. But if you're decoupling into different regions, then this, of course, can lead to companies not having as big a market that they can play with. And so this can have significant implications. There's also then the development of standard wars that might be happening, these type of things. So we need to be thinking about these issues on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, there's always opportunities for certain regions or certain companies to say, hey, look, as you are dealing with these increased tensions, we are a reliable partner for you in terms of the geopolitical environment. Take us as your partner and we will be doing a really good job. So friendshoring is a word that is being used very often. I prefer to use kind of reliable sourcing. So because what you're doing is I mean, it's very difficult to identify who your friends are sometimes, but what you want to do is identify partners who are geopolitically less dangerous, perhaps. So these are kind of opportunities for companies to position themselves more clearly in line with values that previously we might not have been focusing on as much. So I'll leave it here.
Yeah, great. Ilya?
So to tap into one of Ari's point, I think it, of course, makes sense. The broader you can exploit your innovations, the more incentives you're going to have to innovate. But at the same time, also from the resource-based view, we know that imitation is something important to consider. Okay, if your competitors cannot easily imitate, you're also going to get a bigger return from your investment. Okay, so now it might be that governments are actually helping certain multinationals with preventing imitation. Okay, like through legislation and so on. So maybe I think your point is a valid one, but there might be another mechanism at play as well, where some of that government support might stimulate innovation in another kind of way. Again, I'm just raising questions here. I don't have answers, but it shows this is interesting to explore because there might be different effects at play. One more thing related to innovation, and that's something I found in the other paper I've been working on, the Journal of Management piece. There we find that nationalist sentiments reduce your willingness to establish cross-border alliances. Okay, so innovation often requires collaboration, especially collaboration with firms, people that might have different expertise that's complementary and so on. If that finding holds more broadly than that finding in the other paper might suggest that also might have implications on innovation. We collaborate less with people on the other side of the world, and that might reduce our collaboration. Again, there might be much more nuance related to that, but I think it's interesting for us to study, and that kind of gets me excited, and like that should mean a lot of work coming through in JIBS that looks at these, or JI, Journal of International Business Policy, that kind of looks at these issues. Let me stop here.
Great. Darius, do you have any final remarks to add?
I would just say both of the points that my panelists raised are sort of just fascinating. And I think the setting that in our paper that we identify might be some way to get at that, because it allows for nice empirical identification. When you have a shock in terms of a legal shock to the way the environment works, then you can look at these differences. And a lot of these laws are staggered over 30 countries at different points in time. So it might be able to be a fertile testing ground to look at some of these important issues.
Right, so that is actually one of the questions raised by Sichang Liu. So some of the recommendations studying across country setting. So as they are talk about, there are a lot of shocks at different levels at different country. We also have some questions more on specific about measures, about databases. So we don't have time to go to specifics. I would say read those papers carefully. And if you have any questions, reach out to our panelists. I'm sure they are happy to answer all the questions or help you with your own research, things like that. So while with that, I really want to appreciate all those thought-provoking questions from audience, and also thank you our panelists for the time and the insights. But remember, the discussion, the conversation doesn't have to end here, right? So we will continue the conversation offline, and don't forget to subscribe to our upcoming webinars and podcast series. So some people ask in the chat, so all those recordings will be available in the AIB website and also the YouTube channel. Stay tuned for our podcast. Yeah, thank you so much, and have a great day. Good luck with your own research.
Okay.
Klaus?
Thank you, Stephanie, for excellent moderating and stimulating quite an interesting discussion. It's kind of a lot of issues that came out of this research that go beyond the actual studies, both actually highlighting that we actually know a fair bit on how companies do respond to nationalism and new regulatory constraints, but there's a lot of things that we should be doing. So if there are PhD students in the audience, I'm sure they find lots of ideas for how to design and what topics to study. And some of those topics merit studying in different countries. One thing I just wanted to briefly comment on is the conversation that was moving towards deglobalization. And do we really have deglobalization, or do we simply have a substitution effect, or i.e. for what's a constraint for one particular company becomes an opportunity for another? I just looked into FDI data. Here's the OEC database. Overall, the inflow of foreign investment to the US, which I have here, I do not see a big trend change, except that there is something weird happening in the European Union 2022. Maybe that's preliminary data. I'm not sure what's happening. Another thing to say is, of course, the 2008, which is when the CFOS was reformed, is also the year when the global financial crisis happened and asset values declined, and foreign direct investment volume in terms of value is correlated to stock markets. So that effect we do see in 2008, 2009, but beyond that, for international business continues, right? So there is a big question whether you really see deglobalization happening. All right, let me just round up to remind everyone the papers that have been presented today are available online through the websites of respectively JIBS and JIBP. Two of the papers are still in advance online, and the paper by Ari and Yadong is published in the most recent issue of JIBS. On YouTube, you can find our past webinars. We already have 31. So if you're a PhD student interested in any of these topics, you'll find a very valuable resource there. And let me round up by thanking everybody who's been supporting this work indirectly from the back. The webinar coordinators is myself and Dana Minbayeva. And of course, we couldn't do all this work if it wasn't for the work of the editors of the journals, which currently is Rosalie Tung for JIBS. And I guess, Ari, when exactly are you taking over? Should I be putting your picture in there?
I am the incoming editor, and Sariana is the outgoing editor. So we're overlapping until the 1st of January.
Okay, so I'm not wrong to have Sariana as the editor-in-chief for JIBP, but I shall replace that for the next webinar. We have some more webinars in discussion. You will find the information through the usual channels, where it's AIB list or social media. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.